Podcasting from the beautiful state of Maine, welcome to another episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast, the show that focuses on identifying and developing the skills and behaviors that will inspire, empower, and compel others to follow your lead. Listen as Patrick's guests talk about the powerful leadership approaches they have identified and developed, which are vital for leading in today's challenging times. These are the same approaches that will positively impact you as a leader too. Learning from Leaders provides the right balance of leadership research with real-world scenarios, making it easy for you to rise above your best. All right, let's start the show.
Hey everybody, I'm Patrick Veroneau, and thank you for joining me on another episode of Learning from Leaders. And on today's episode, we're going to talk about a model, specifically the leadership success sequence. And it was developed by a recent former AstraZeneca executive named Larry Freedman, who I was so happy to be able to interview for this podcast as he sets out on the next phase of his journey in helping others to become better leaders. A couple things that stood out for me in terms of our conversation that really fit in line directly with what this podcast is about is that he talked about the continuous drive to improve as a leader. And the tagline of this podcast is leaders are learners. And it's so true. And he spoke to that throughout this in his model. So again, so honored to be able to have him on the podcast and talk about a model that he used, and one that in the very short time that I had to meet with him and interact, I saw this model in him. So let's get into it. Larry, thanks again for being on the podcast. As I mentioned in the intro to this, you really have capped off a pretty distinguished career in the pharmaceutical industry, leaving as an executive in the sales arena, right? An executive business director. You have so much knowledge, I think, that we can tap into now. And as you get ready to sort of embark on the next space that you're going to make your mark and your impact, I wanted to really see if we could dig into something that you had provided, which was a model that you really created. And the title of it is the Leadership Success Sequence. As I looked through that, I thought, boy, this has so much to it. And your lengthy experience of using this, I think, has so much value now.
Well, thanks a lot for the opportunity. It's really an honor. Certainly one of my favorite topics is leadership and how we can help leaders be even more effective in their role. So I'm excited for the conversation, and thank you.
As I mentioned, right, you had created this leadership success sequence, and there really are 4 components that you talk about. I'll just hit on them quickly, and I hope we can dig into them individually, right? You talk about building a relationship. Creating a strong culture is number 2, enhancing capabilities, and then lastly, driving results.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Over my time as a leader, I was always trying to each year do things better and different, try to evolve as a leader. And over my years, I had some really great teams, very, very proud of the performance that we had and the patients that we served while doing so. I started to think about it after a while, that what were some of the commonalities? Why were these teams, aside from having great people, having the success that they were having? And it really came down to this somewhat basic formula that you just described that I've deemed the success sequence. And the word sequence is really important because it does follow a specific order. So Pat, as you mentioned, really the very first part of the success sequence in leading a team is to build relationships with the people on your team. May sound basic, but sometimes leaders don't take the time necessary to build the relationships in a very genuine, authentic, and meaningful way. Get to know the person beyond what they do at AstraZeneca, but who they are as a person, what their interests are outside of work, their family, their hobbies. Those things matter, but it's really key that in doing so, that there's a genuine and sincere interest, and that it certainly doesn't come across in any way, shape, form, or fashion as transactional. Once you've built the relationship with each individual on the team, and it really is individual conversations that happen over time, you start to create a culture. And a culture really is that tie that binds each individual that's on the team. What is it that connects them all? What is that North Star that you're all shooting for, that common vision, that common mission, that common passion that creates the culture? And then depending upon what your role is within the organization, and I led second level leaders at my organization. Then that cascade to the next level, which are district sales managers. So it would go from 8 regional sales director or commercial business directors to 54 district sales managers. And are they buying into the culture and the belief and the mission? And then from the district sales managers, it cascades to between 400 and 500 sales representatives. And when you have that and it's done well, you have a culture. From there, right, you have great relationships, you have a culture, you have a belief system, then enhancing capabilities, really identifying within the organization, but also within each person. What are the skill gaps that may exist with each individual? What are the holistic skill gaps that the team can get better at? So it really comes down to enhancing capabilities or developing people. And one thing I wanted to say, and it kind of ties into the sequence, constructive feedback lands as criticism unless there's a relationship. So that relationship is really, really important to have. Feedback without a relationship can land as criticism. That's what I was trying to say. So once you have the relationships, you have the culture, and you've really worked on those gaps, those opportunities to make the team and individuals better, the natural manifestation of those 3 things are driving performance and driving results. I've been asked about this, especially from new leaders that have said, well, how long do I spend on each one? Well, it's more of a concept, Pat, than anything else. Well, we're going to do relationships for 2 weeks, and then we're going to move to culture. It happens organically, and it's, again, more conceptually as you think about it. What you probably don't want to do is your very first sit down with your very first rep, and perhaps a common mistake of new managers that want to impress with results, is you take out the market share charts, the volume charts, and you start going through it before you've even asked the person his or her name. I'm being facetious, but let me tell you, it happens.
There's a lot to unpack here. So if we take a step back and look at relationships, this to me is the foundation. And you said it yourself, right? It seems so simple. What is simple and what's done, or what's common sense and what's applied, are oftentimes not the same thing. The behaviors make the difference here in terms of the relationships. If I don't feel as though you care about me as an individual, I don't care how much you know, your title, your own success as a manager, as a rep, it misses the mark if I don't think that you care for me as an individual first. So I love that you bring that up, because I do think it's an important component to this. You know, I look at this in the environment that we're in now, which we haven't even really hit on yet, is this, the market, the industry has changed so much over the last 2 years, right, as the start of the pandemic happened. And I know we had this conversation earlier. I got into the industry back in, I think it was 1998. And I remember coming into the industry at that point, and old timers, right? People that have been in the industry for a while said, oh, it's changed so much. This is the end. It's never going to survive because of the changes. So I think, right, you hear that about every 5 years. We're in that environment right now. And how cliche is this? Well, this time it's different. I think there is a seismic shift that's happened just because of access and things like that, that I think if you don't have good relationships with those individuals, it makes it very difficult to have difficult conversations about what are the real challenges that reps are facing in the field right now, in the medical field, in this current environment.
Yeah, Pat, like you said, we could talk about and we will talk about the current environment, but there's something I wanted to build on, and I want to make sure I get the T word in as it relates to relationships. And of course, that is trust. That is trust. That's foundational to everything, because behind trust, then people understand your intention, which is really, really important. So yeah, totally agree with you.
Yeah, to me, it's the mortar between the bricks of all the other stuff. If you don't have trust, this stuff doesn't work. You mentioned something else I thought that was really interesting, right? When you talked about, you dealt with second level managers, how important it is for this to start at the top, right? Where you're setting the course for this, you need to make sure that you have 8 people that report to you, that they've all bought into this. And then to ensure that those 8 then make sure that, what did you say, 25 or so?
No, it was 50 something.
Oh, so 50, yeah, that they then buy into it, right? Before it ever gets to the people that really are going to be impacted by this, the people on the front line, the salespeople. Is there anything that you did in particular to ensure that that was happening?
Yeah, thanks for asking. And one of the things, and again, as a concept, that we led to was the concept of leading 2 levels deep. So for me, I was the executive business director, and some people may know that term as national sales director. So yes, I led the second level leaders from a functional responsibility and had daily interactions seemingly with each one. But when you lead 2 levels deep, it's also important that I develop meaningful relationships with the district managers, those frontline managers. And I did that. Anytime I had an opportunity, whether it was a one-on-one phone call, of which during the pandemic, I actually spoke with all 54 individually over time to see how they were doing, to see how their teams were doing, to see what was keeping them up at night. But there were a number of different forums that I would create to talk to those district sales managers to get a better sense of the culture. Now, 2 levels deep also means the second level, or the commercial business directors, it was important for them to have relationships with the representatives. And then as a concept, the district sales managers, if they're going 2 levels deep into their organization, that's customers. And it's important that they have those customer relationships. So again, as a concept, leading 2 levels deep is really a way to gain insight into the culture that you're creating as close as you can possibly get it. And that's not to say I didn't have a lot of conversations with the representatives. And if any of them are listening to this, they certainly know that. Created a number of forums to talk to them as well.
Yeah, I love that. That's a great concept. So we move on to, in the sequence, enhancing capabilities. And what better area to now start talking about enhancing capabilities than the environment that most reps, I would say, are into, is a virtual selling environment, which historically, that's not something that was regularly done. I mean, there were times where we would do it, but that's the standard way we're doing this. So I'd be curious, how did you approach that?
I'm laughing because prior to the pandemic, we would use Skype, which had a camera capability, but no one ever thought to even turn the camera on. I mean, 2019, early 2020. Now every meeting is on Zoom or Teams, and it's the exception if the camera's off. You're wondering, why is that camera off? So yeah, things have certainly changed. Virtual selling, I do believe, is here to stay. I really, really do. And I think what I've seen is it falls into 2 camps. I think the first camp is, well, we'll do it if we have to do it. Maybe I'm not 100% comfortable doing it, but when everything locked down, that was the only opportunity. But then I think you have others that have embraced the hybrid selling environment and really look for opportunities to sell virtually, to bring value to their customers. And in some cases, depending on the environment, you can be in almost 2 places at the same time, give or take, when you're selling virtually. The other thing that you can do virtually, and again, during the pandemic, and I guess we're still in the pandemic, I was often invited onto calls. So I could start to forge relationships with customers in one specific case who was out in San Diego and was able to meet this customer, this HCP, this doctor, this cardiologist virtually, forge a great relationship, exchange cell phone numbers. The doctor then actually called me when he changed his prescribing behavior to the product that was being promoted at the time. And then when I went out to San Diego, the doctor actually changed his schedule to meet the representative and I for lunch. So there's all different things, ways to be creative and to leverage people in headquarters to lend their expertise to customers while they're at home or in the headquarter office.
Yeah. And without question, I think you bring up a point that I would hit on this, is to say that there's always going to be a lack of resources. There's always a time when we're not going to have what we need. The budget isn't there. The time isn't there. We all have equal access to resourcefulness. And I think, if anything, this pandemic has really created an environment where I think being resourceful is what's going to make the difference. And the other part that I thought was really interesting in what you said is about adding value. I think this has created an environment where you need to demonstrate value quickly because people don't have a lot of time. I do a lot of work in healthcare now, and I see the other end of this where they spend most of their day in Zoom calls, and what they've termed it is Zoomitis at this point. And the other thing that they've said is the people that they have as participants on these calls sometimes are what they call zombies, that they're so tired of being on these Zoom calls that they're not truly present. And again, I think this in the biotech environment is something where there's a real opportunity. If you can present value in this shorter period of time, it does earn you the opportunity for other things down the road, like the story you mentioned about the physician in California?
I think you have to. So many of the interactions in pharmaceuticals are often by chance, meaning a representative's in the hospital and runs into a customer in the hallway. A representative's in a hospital and runs into a customer in a cafe. Yes, there's appointments, of course, but when you go to virtual, those serendipitous meetings, or if you're in the office in the sample closet or by the front desk, they don't happen.
Right.
It has to be an office staff or the HCP, the customer, going to the laptop or going to the iPad or going to the PC and logging on and turning it on. In order to do that, they have to perceive that there's going to be an absolute value in doing that. Otherwise, it's not going to happen.
Right. Larry, you mentioned something, though, that I think, in my experience, many managers didn't want to address, and whether it was out of, their own discomfort. But you mentioned something that there's serendipity. A lot of interactions are just going to happen by coincidence, by being in the right spot. And I think in sales in general, I would always say that I thought there were 3 C's to selling. One is it's coincidence, meaning it just happened, right day, right time. One was causal, meaning the rep actually directly impacted the choosing of the treatment that was done based on being there. And then the other part was correlation to the selling. It wasn't direct. You didn't need to be there, but because you had laid the foundation long enough, it was going to happen. And I think too often we get nervous thinking, well, that means we don't add a lot of value. If, right, we can talk about territories that were qualifying for President's Club that were vacant, right? Well, that says there were probably times where that was a lot of coincidence that it just so happened. But that doesn't take away the value that reps provide. Let's realize that some of this is going to take place by itself, but to really move the needle to get the most value, the rep has to do those things that adds values to create more correlation.
Well, I think you could look at every different study and analysis and so forth. And in the end of the day, there's no greater value than a representative's positive influence or persuasion with a customer.
Yeah.
You can send all the emails you want. You can do everything else you want with digital and journals and congresses and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, that representative having a relationship with that customer, presenting the features and the benefits and the value proposition of their specific product and how it serves patients, that ultimately is and will always be the most effective way to sell a pharmaceutical product. So I don't think, Pat, that sales representatives going away anytime soon. There's a great value proposition for them. I think also just a point worth mentioning is in COVID, many of the rules have changed. I think the representatives that are able to get the most time and have the most influence, whether it's virtual or whether it's live, following the rules of the office or the institution, are those with relationships and those with connections to the customer, to the office. That is a competitive advantage and always will be.
Yeah. Along those lines, if you look at the success sequence that you've set up in looking 2019 to now 2022, is there one in that sequence that you say probably needs a little more attention in today's environment, or are they all equally the same?
I think every aspect of the success sequence, and of course, we didn't talk a lot about driving results because driving results are that manifestation of the relationships, the culture, and the capabilities. But we certainly cannot lose sight of driving results. I mean, that's super important in serving patients when you drive results. If I looked at the sequence and I said, okay, so which one, as a result of the pandemic, has been impacted the most? I mean, to me, and this is personal taste, it was culture. Yes, we're able to form a connection with the team virtually, but we have so many stories of people that were hired over the last, and now we're talking pretty much 2 years, heading into year 3. They were hired by someone via Zoom. They'd never met that person.
Yeah.
There were always jokes if they finally met live that so-and-so was taller or shorter than they actually thought because everyone's the same height on Zoom. But the thing that I missed the most, especially when everyone was in lockdown in 2020, were the opportunities to, the hugs, the handshakes, the team meetings, the dinners, the time in the car with the sales representative, the getting to know you aspect of it. That's how the culture truly gets built over time. And I really do hope as we broadcast this or as we take this, we're in the height of another wave of COVID, but hopefully when things can return to some degree of normalcy, the great things that created culture are able to come back and then some, because it's really, really important. It makes a difference. And capturing hearts and minds, it's hard to do it through a Zoom meeting. It really is.
Yeah, without question. I would agree with you there overall, regardless of where we are. I think I would label it as isolation. The more we've been isolated, the harder it is. We're herd animals. We need each other, right? There's a huge drive for that. And I, again, for what it's worth, at least anecdotally, what I'm hearing is that people are ready for that. They're willing to sort of take whatever a little more risk might involve, but they want that. They want that connection as opposed to a Zoom call. So I think it's going to happen sooner.
Yeah, I hope it does. And again, I'm laughing because you talk about isolation. If anyone from my former colleagues are listening to this podcast, I would remember when the mailman used to pull up. It's like the highlight of the day if I could actually get out there and say hello to someone that was not on Zoom or outside of my immediate family. So yes, the isolation part of it is certainly hard, especially with the type of people, generally speaking, that make up a sales force.
Right.
That's not to say the sales force doesn't have introverts, and there's nothing wrong with being introverted, but generally speaking, the profile of sales leader and sales representative, generally speaking, is one that of an extrovert, someone that doesn't like to be locked in their bunker for hours on end on Zoom calls.
Yeah, on those lines, it will drive my wife nuts if we're out in public. If I sense any type of opening for a conversation with somebody in an elevator or wherever it might be, and she will give me an eye every so often, like, we don't have time for this. Like, do not get into a conversation right now, because she knows I can't help myself. I want to step into something that we had talked about briefly, and it was around accountability. And it was interesting to hear the way you phrased it, because I share a similar opinion of it. So I'd love to hear you talk about your view of accountability.
Yeah. One of the terms that I've just grown to hate over the years, and I want to qualify it, is hold accountable. I'm going to hold you accountable. I'm holding you accountable for the quality of this podcast. To me, we could even debate the word accountable, but to me, I like the word inspire accountability. Because when you inspire accountability, it's more of a partnership between you and the person. You're going after a goal together. You're motivating, you're capturing hearts, you're capturing minds. And when you inspire accountability, you're much more likely to gain that person's commitment. When you hold someone accountable, when you hold them accountable, you're probably at best going to get compliance. They're going to do what they think you want them to do because you're their boss. That, to me, is not the secret sauce, so to speak. It's how do you inspire, capture hearts and minds, gain commitment, and together go tackle a goal.
Yeah. To me, it's the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic, right? The intrinsic is, I want to do this. I'm motivated to do this, not because I'm afraid if I don't, the stick is coming out, but I believe in this. I look at it as ownership. We're all going after the same thing here. And what's interesting that you said earlier about the sequence itself is it's not as though we're going to spend 2 weeks on relationship, then we're going to spend 2 weeks on culture. I think here's where, even if there is a sequence to it, it's a dance at this point where inspiring accountability builds a better relationship with that person, and I think impacts culture as well in a different way, because we're known as a culture that isn't about just whacking each other over the head and pointing fingers, but we're in this together.
Yeah, Pat, I know that you do a lot of reading and a lot of research and into the analytics, and it doesn't matter what Google search you do. Engaged employees are more productive employees. It's really that simple. So in the end, it really comes down to how do we get that discretionary effort? How do we tap into that employee engagement and enhance that employee experience that each person is having? We're in a very strange time right now with this whole great resignation where people, just not in pharmaceuticals, but just everywhere, perhaps uninspired by their jobs, or perhaps seeking to do something else, or perhaps to be at home, whatever the case may be, are not connecting with their employer. The employee experience, how they feel about their organization, how they feel about their jobs, and how they feel about their manager and their culture. They're massive. I've used the term secret sauce now a few times. I'll use it again. That's what it is. It's tapping into that.
Yeah, I would agree. In relation, I should say, to the Great Resignation, because I've heard that so much, and certainly you can't deny the number of people that have actually quit their jobs and are going other places. I would argue, especially in what I've seen either personally over the last 5 years or in a decade or so of just research in different areas, is that I think there are a lot of people that resigned many years ago, emotionally and intellectually. It's just that physically they are now resigning. And I think that's a result of more opportunities being available and also people just deciding that enough is enough. I don't want to do this anymore. Either I'm going to start my own business, I'm going to retire early because I'm not going to put up with this anymore. But the thought that all of a sudden everybody had a light bulb moment a month ago or 2 months ago to say, I'm going to quit. My experience has been, if you look at the research from Gallup over 2 decades, people quit a long time ago. It's just that physically their bodies are now going with them.
The mental resignation precedes the physical one.
Without question.
And a perceptive, intuitive, insightful manager can pick that up in his or her people and understand when that's happened.
And what's important about that is that, if you follow the research from Gallup, and I can certainly say from my own anecdotal experience in working with organizations, is that about 70% of that engagement or feeling of engagement or disengagement is the direct result of who the person reports to. That's a huge number. And I think for organizations to recognize that's a huge responsibility to put on a manager that supposedly is taking care of your most important asset, your people.
Yeah. You also have to, more than assume, you have to know that the manager is also checked in as well.
Yeah.
Because if the manager, and that's the first dysfunction of a team, right? If the manager's checked out or has that mental resignation, well, what do you think's going to happen to the 8, 10, or 12 individuals that he or she is responsible for? So there's a responsibility really right up the line as it relates to leadership and ensuring that emotional connection, that engagement is there with everyone.
Yeah, so true. So here you are transitioning to your next phase, and allows us to then talk about legacy, which is, I know, another topic that you find very important. I think you're sort of living it now.
Yeah. Legacy, I guess, would be the fifth part of the success sequence if there was a fifth concept. Legacy is interesting, Pat, because legacy obviously is what you leave behind. But once your legacy is shaped, and legacy can be certainly an individual thing, or depending upon your impact, it can be a broad consensus type of thing. But your legacy's been formed. Your legacy has been shaped. There's generally not a chance to go back and make it better or make it worse. It is what it is. And that legacy and the impact that you've had on people should be important to every single leader. And what you find is a legacy transcends time, and a legacy transcends organization. I can remember back when I started as a sales rep, the first national sales director that we ever had, and how he would come on stage and there'd be a room at the time of 200, 300, 400 people. And he was such a dynamic public speaker, an influencer. And you'd think he's looking at you the entire time. You're looking around at your friends. Is he looking at anybody else? But that's the legacy. And when I talk to colleagues from back then, we all have that same perspective. So I hope for the people that I've led over the years that I've been with my organization, that I left a lasting legacy. Maybe it was a quote, maybe it was a strategy or a tactic, a resource, whatever it was, a relationship, a connection that we had. And something comes up and they go, oh yeah, I remember that. And you get a text years later. That's special. And it should be important to every leader. What's the legacy that you're leaving behind for folks that invested in you and followed you as a part of your organization?
Yeah.
So, thank you.
If you think about it, what a great exercise to do right out of the gate in terms of a leadership development course, or as you're developing leaders within your organization, is that becomes an exercise. What would you want your legacy to be as you start your leadership career? What do you want that to look like? Because I think that says a lot in terms of how you shape the direction you go and the behaviors you exhibit. I know for you, right, as you're looking now into the next phase of your career, you want to be able to do that again and help to develop legacies for others. What's the best way if somebody were interested in wanting to find out more about Larry and your experiences and what you can provide them, how can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, LinkedIn. I'll post this podcast to my LinkedIn, but on my LinkedIn profile is my email is certainly there, or the messenger function on LinkedIn works. So absolutely, feel free. I'd love to hear from people, whether they're people that I've known or whether they're new friends or whether somebody watched this podcast and they say, hey, I had a question. I'd love to talk to you more about the success sequence. I'd love to talk to them about it as well. And Pat, slightly off the question, but I did want to say this. One thing that's really, really important is also your network. And I think your legacy isn't mutually exclusive from your network. And while I was at my organization, anybody reached out to me from a networking perspective, whether internal or external. I was always very quick to respond and do whatever I could. Well, now I'm on the other side of that. And I have to say, I'm very, very grateful to the network of people that I've known over the years, some still with the organization and many not, because I reach out, and you're a great example. You're a great example. And we hadn't spoken in quite some time. We reached out, and here we're doing this podcast together.
Yeah. I'll add on to that in terms of what you talk about, because I think it's been 5 years or close to it when I left. And we met through my proposals and what I wanted to try and bring to the organization that you're with in regards to some leadership ideas that I'm doing. Now, when I left and started my own company, I reached out to you in terms of a connection. Now, there was nothing in it for you to connect with me, right? You didn't see down the road, I'm probably going to want to reach out at some point because I'm going to be starting a new venture. There was none of that. You did it because we had a connection. And I won't forget that in terms of the conversations that we had, because you were an executive. You took the time to listen to what I was proposing for the organization. And you did it sincerely. And I felt that. So I want to say that what you've talked about here in this sequence, in a very short period of time, our interactions, I experienced it. So it's legitimate.
Thank you. And listen, I'd be remiss if I went this entire podcast without thanking AstraZeneca. They're a great organization with great people and great products. And just to express my gratitude to an outstanding organization. And at the same time, acknowledge I am excited to start that next chapter, but I wanted to do that. And I also, if I could, leave you with a quote. I love this quote, and it's genuine. And that's, as a leader, your goal should be to make every interaction count and leave people better than you found them. And if you can replicate that through one-on-one conversations with 10 people, conversations with a region of 60 people, or conversations on Zoom with 500 people, you've had success. So with that, I thank you so much for this opportunity, and I wish you luck and continued success, Pat, at what you do. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks. Wishing you the best. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, please feel free to rate, review, and subscribe on your preferred podcast listening platform. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time, keep rising above your best as a leader.